Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming. It's my absolute pleasure and privilege to be hosting this evening with Gary Younge, and we'll be discussing his book, which I've got here, Who Are We and Why Should It Matter in the 21st Century? There's two things I'd like to say about this book. One is that for somebody like me growing up, for whom race and identity was always such a prescient issue and still one that I'm constantly thinking about, talking about, this book is a really important piece of work at this particular moment in time. And the second thing is that there's nobody, and this is what everybody who's reviewed the book has agreed, there's nobody more qualified than Gary to discuss this subject. This is something Gary's been writing about for years in The Guardian and elsewhere. And I won't steal his thunder. He's going to talk about the book, and then I'm going to ask some questions. The floor will be open for you to ask questions. We'll keep it informal. So after Gary's finished speaking, if you'd like to raise your hand if you have a question, please do. And we'll have a little bit of back and forth. But I hope that this conversation will allow you to really, if you haven't read the book, which I urge you to do, get a sense of the really important issues that Gary's discussing. And what I think is its absolute strength, which is that the breadth, but also the way that he's taken the conversation forward in ways that hasn't really been done before. So, Gary, over to you.
Thank you. I want to thank you all for coming. There's actually quite a few familiar faces in the audience, which is nice. Actually, particularly, if it's not too embarrassing for her, the woman who gave me my first break at The Guardian, this is Dominique Jackson, who's sitting towards the back there. There's her hand. Who I came in as a 24-year-old and with lots of ideas in a couple of languages, and Dominique said, I'll give you a go. And many other people wouldn't have. And people who start you out on your journeys, I think, it's always important to acknowledge and embrace that. So this book is really an attempt to, I like to call it a discursive attempt. Identity is something that we talk about often, but we talk about badly, I think, often ignorantly, often way too defensively, or passive-aggressively. It's really a desire to kind of help shape that conversation. And as much as there are kind of any kind of guiding narrative argument that goes through the book, it's really that identity is a very important place to start and a very bad place to finish. That we all come to, particularly in politics, we all come to our politics and our lives with baggage. And it's very important to recognize what that baggage is and to acknowledge it, to check it in, if you will, before you can start on any kind of broader journey. But that if that's where it ends, then it's a very limiting, fundamentalist kind of approach. It can be a fundamentalism, the one we talk about most often is religion, but it can be a fundamentalism of race, of region, of gender, of nation. And it's really to say, look, we are all many things, black, female, male, gay, straight, and we are also just one thing, which is ourselves. And how do we make sense of both of those things at the same time? I'm going to read a very short bit and then just talk you through what the book's about, so that when the conversation starts, you have some idea of where the book is going. Identity is like fire. It can create warmth and comfort or burn badly and destroy. It's at the forefront of some of the most inspiring achievements in world political history, whether it be women's suffrage, the end of apartheid, or advances in gay rights. But it's also taken centre stage in the most lurid moments of global affairs. The Holocaust, the wars in Rwanda, Bosnia, Darfur, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Identity can make connections over oceans, languages, generations, and cultures. On the day the US went to the polls in 2008 to elect a new president, Obama Sorin Ilya Scorcha was born in the tiny Romanian village of Rusiori. When I saw Obama on TV, my heart swelled with joy, his granny said. I thought he was one of us Roma because of his skin colour. She hoped his name would bring him luck. But identity can also sow division among those who live side by side. On the day Obama Scorcha was born, 94% of black Californians voted for Barack Obama, and around 55% voted against gay marriage. Black churches were the focal point for both efforts. The largest democracy in the world, India, and the newest electorates, Iraq and Afghanistan, all have political cultures underpinned by allegiances to sects, castes, religion, warlords, or ethnic groups. No one is immune from these contradictions. None of us comes to politics from a vacuum. We arrive with affiliations that mould our worldview. It was no coincidence that women led the charge for female suffrage, or that Ghanaians spearheaded the battle for Ghanaian independence. Had they waited for men or the British occupier to come round to these ideas, they might still be waiting. But on the other hand, we are all more unalike than we are alike. We are more alike than we are unalike, Whether it's the Manchester United supporting fish and chip eating bombers of the London transport system, the homophobic Denver preacher who paid for sex with a male prostitute, or the Bush family in its long history of connections with the Bin Ladens, the other is rarely as foreign or as threatening as we are led to believe. Growing numbers of us watch the same shows, eat the same food and wear the same brands. Never have we travelled as much, interbred as much, or conversed as much. But on the other hand, the ways in which we are unalike matter. For all that's common in the human experience, the differences are stark and in some respects getting starker. And it's these differences that are increasingly creating a framework for political activity, public anxiety, and at times, moral panic. In 2008, France denied citizenship to a 32-year-old Moroccan-born woman who's married to a French national, has lived in the country for 8 years, speaks good French, and has 3 French-born children, because the authorities believed she was a Muslim fundamentalist. Within half an hour's train ride from Brussels, the polyglot home to both NATO and the EU, the European Commission, children in Flemish schools are not allowed to speak French in a playground. In China, they have banned Buddhist monks in Tibet from reincarnating without government permission, in the hope of crushing nationalist dissent. Obvious as it may seem, it bears emphasising, if only because so many well-meaning people are in denial about it, that in all sorts of ways our differences make a difference. Now, because I'm not a philosopher or an academic, what I do with this book is take it on the road. I go and interview people, talk to people, looking through various themes. The first thing I do is to interrogate myself and the baggage that I bring to this in a chapter called Me, Myself, I. And I'm just going to read you the opening quotes that I have for each chapter from some of the chapters to give you a sense of where those are going. Every human being at every stage of history is born into a society from his earliest years and is moulded by that society. Both language and environment help to determine the character of his thought. His earliest ideas come to him from others. His earliest words come to him from others. The individual apart from society would be both speechless and mindless. That's from E.H. Carr. And so these words and these ideas that we get from others inform how we act and what we do. And in that and the next chapter, I look at how the more powerful you are, the less likely you are to really understand that nobody has asked me, when did you first realise you were straight? Or how do you balance your work and childcare? Those are questions that would be asked to others. And that the more powerful you are, the less likely you are to understand that the things you have are actually identities. But that doesn't mean that they're not. It just means that nobody is interrogating them. Chapter 3 is called The Chronicles of Cablanasia, and it starts with Tiger Woods and his declaration that he's not black, he's Cablanasian, which is a conflation of Caucasian, black, Indian and Asian, which are the different ethnicities of his parents. And I try and make the point that all identities are constructed. And actually, they emerge from communities. They don't really have to make sense. They just have to have a power structure that can keep them going. That there's no logic behind why, for example, in America, one side of the Rio Grande is Mexico and the other side is America. But while there's no logic to that, and that's an arbitrary decision, the borders have been elsewhere, the fact of which side of that line you're on matters quite a lot in terms of your life expectancy, your rights to health and social security, and a whole heap of other things. And these constructs that exist fall apart as soon as we try and define them. One quite funny thing that I hear third, fourth, fifth generation Chicanos saying who live in Arizona or Texas and New Mexico is, we didn't cross the border crossed us. In all sorts of ways, things that we think we know, things that we think are definite, as soon as you try and define them, they fall apart in your hands. And the quote at the beginning of this book is apartheid, South Africa, trying to define race, trying to define what a white person is. Now, if you think about it, there's a lot riding on this in 1950. So this is from the Population Registration Act. A white person is any person who in appearance obviously is or who is generally accepted as a white person, other than a person who, although in appearance obviously a white person, is generally accepted as a coloured person. Crazy. And yet in that chapter I look at what I call the tale of two white girls, one of whom is Sandra Lang, who's born to two Afrikaner parents. And the paternity test shows she's very much her father's daughter, but she comes out very, very dark. She comes out black. Sandra Lang is reclassified 3 times in her life. Once she's reclassified from white to coloured. Yes, the school reclassifies her from white to coloured. The parents reclassify her back to white after a long battle. And then Sandra realizes that she can't live as a white person when she looks like a black person, and she then reclassifies herself to coloured. But then there's another white girl who grows up in Blue Blood, Connecticut, and who, Bliss Broyard, and who on her father's deathbed learns that her father has been passing, and actually he was a black man from Louisiana, just a very light-skinned black man. And the story, her book One Drop, follows her journey of trying to work out what's going on there. But if you think of these two girls, actually the one with the most logical claim on blackness would be the one who's, on whiteness, would be the one whose two parents are white, you would think. And if you applied a different logic of looking at them, the one who would most obviously be white is the white one. And race is a nonsense. And we're all actually essentially mixed race. It's just that we don't all count as mixed race. And yet, arbitrary though it is, the definition matters. It mattered a lot to Sandra Lang. It made a huge difference to her life experience. The next one is called Blessed Are the Gatekeepers, and it looks at Israel, where in one tick of the pen, 40,000 people were told that they were no longer Jewish. The rabbinate, which controls all the life cycle events in Israel, so marriage, funerals, bar mitzvahs and so on, decided that one conversion judge had been way too lenient. And all of the people who he had converted over the last several years were struck off. And if they were women, then their children were struck off. And it looks at how every identity has its gatekeeper, these people who extract the price for your membership and decide the difference between belonging and banishment, who tell you, if it's McCarthyite America, that you are un-American for thinking certain things. If it's Black Britain, that you are not black enough for doing certain things. In the case of the conversions, the child of a famous Jewish theologian was told he was not Jewish, and one of the reasons given was that he was an actor who liked Shakespeare, and Shakespeare was, according to this rabbi, a well-known anti-Semite. The next chapter, called The Truth in Their Eyes, looks at how all identities are fluid, that they all change. And the issue is not whether they change, but how they change. Not all change is good, but no change is not possible. And for that, I go to Ireland and look at the status of women in Ireland, which has changed massively over the past 15 to 20 years as a result of rapid economic development. That in 1960, every third child born in Dublin was a woman's fifth child. Now, every third child born in Ireland is born outside of wedlock. These are major changes that have taken place because of the major economic changes in Ireland. The next is called The Many in One, and it looks at the fact that we all have many identities, and that to try and play them off one against each other is defeating, it's defeatist, and ultimately corrosive. And for that, I followed the Obama and Hillary campaigns, in which members of Hillary's camp suggested that white women had it far, far worse than black men. And my response to that isn't to say, no, that's not true, but please don't talk like that, because no one wins that race to the bottom. But similarly, the way that this particular face-off was understood was that somehow black women would be rent asunder by the task of having to choose between a black man and a white woman. And so the questions on CNN and so on, what are black women going to do in this kind of very difficult situation? As though they were either black sometimes or female sometimes, but could never quite get it together to be both in the same body at the same time. To which one response, apart from the fact that, well, I assume that they will vote their interests, is why would they not ask that question about white men? They have a man and they have a white person to choose from. And one of the answers to that would be that white men in this context aren't seen to have identities that would need to play out in that way. The penultimate chapter is called The Enemy Within, and it looks at the issue of power and identities, that while it's important not to play identities off against each other, it's also important not to pretend that different identities don't have different powers. To pretend that, well, gay and straight are both equal because they're both sexual orientations. Well, we know that's not true. And to illustrate that, I look at Muslims in Britain and the way in which Islam is characterized, and I would say derogated at the moment, in a way that one would not think of talking about other faiths in this time. In other times it would have been other faiths, and particularly Catholicism is the most obvious one in this country, but that during a period where the Catholic Church is riven with accusations of child sex abuse, and the Church of England is struggling with issues of homophobia, the notion that Islam is the greatest threat to Western civilization seems to me pretty far from the mark. And one illustration that I use in that chapter is the Danish cartoons scenario, where, for those of you who missed it, the Danish paper Jyllands-Posten published these cartoons of Muhammad, which I believe they absolutely had a right to do. But I also believe that just because you have a right to do something doesn't mean that you have to do it, that there's no compulsion to offend. And two things about that particular situation. One was that Jyllands-Posten had been offered cartoons the year before that ridiculed Jesus and during Easter, And they had said, we can't do that because it will offend our readers. So the notion that in some way Jyllands-Posten were being brave, I think is somewhat ridiculous. But also that the right to offend must at least come with one subsequent right, which is the right to be offended. And notwithstanding any and all allegations of violence, which of course are reprehensible and should be condemned, the conversation that came afterwards actually objected to the ideas that Muslims should be offended, that they could be offended, when that was the whole point. And that when it comes to satire, particularly in times like these, it has to be something so completely beyond the pale in order for it to be funny. That if there's actually a chance that this might happen, or that people might think a certain thing, if it plays into a dominant stereotype, then I would argue it's not satire, it's bullying. The last is called Lost in Translation. And I go to Brussels, and I look at the idea that in this polyglot city, just around the corner, within 19 minutes train ride, there are these serious linguistic divisions taking place where children are being banned from speaking French in Flemish schools and so on. And that's an attempt to look at how neoliberal globalization has really undermined avenues for democracy, for ways in which we might change our world. And in those moments, people retreat into their identities. When they have a lack of power and a lack of control, people retreat into things that they can control, whether it's region or language or postcode gangs or whatever it is, that these are all expressions of helplessness, really. And then what we have in Europe is a rise in nationalism that has taken place, has coincided with the collapse of borders. That as the borders have come down and people have felt less and less in control, they have resorted to and retreated to the most atavistic kinds of nationalism, to the extent where fascism is now once again a mainstream ideology in Europe. And then the conclusion, and unlike the conclusion that I like to often read in many books that actually says, well, look, here's what to think, here's where it's going. This conclusion says it's complicated. And while it's complicated, there are certain things certain principles that we can lay down, that we shouldn't overindulge sensitivities, but there's nothing too great about being insensitive either. And that at the end of the day, we all have a unifying identity, which is our humanity. And it's very difficult to express that humanity if, as half the world does, if you live on less than $2 a day. And then in the post-war period, in this period, the collapse of the post-war consensus about universal human rights means that the way in which we talk about people like asylum seekers and immigrants in the West is increasingly that they don't deserve humanity. That whatever else they are, in some way, they're like residents of District 9, that they are beyond the pale. And so we've moved from gated communities to essentially gated continents and gated nations, fortified and defended where necessary with incarceration and criminalization. And I use the example of The Boy Who Cried Wolf. The one thing that many people forget about The Boy Who Cried Wolf was that there was a wolf. And when it comes to identity, there is always a wolf lurking somewhere. There are always people who would like to manipulate identities, to divide us, and to really cement their own power. But the other thing that must be remembered about The Boy Who Cried Wolf is that time and again, the villagers come to rescue the boy, even after he has lied to them 1 and 2 times. They come to rescue the boy, and they come together because they understand that he can't do it on his own. So I'm going to leave it there. And Afua.
Thanks, Gary. And I think that everyone's probably got a sense of the fact that this book is almost overwhelming in its scope. But that's what's important as well, I think, is the bigger picture. And I want to pick up on what I take to be one of the main messages of your book, which is that division can be dangerous. But also what you said right at the beginning, which is that when we're talking about identity, we almost need to all acknowledge the luggage that we carry and check it in a way, in order to then continue on the journey. So the first question I want to ask you is, how can we start that when there's still such ignorance and almost a complete lack of sophistication, really, in such kind of huge sections of society dealing with identity? And I just want to read something that you didn't read, but that kind of struck me when I read it. And this is an interview with Obama by Steve Croft on CBS just before Obama declared his candidacy. And Croft says, "Your mother was white, your father was African." And Obama says, "Right." Croft, "You spend most of your life in a white household." Obama, "Yeah." Croft, "I mean, you grew up white." Obama, "I'm not sure that would be true. I think what would be true is that I don't have the typical background of African Americans." Croft, "You were raised in a white household." Obama, "Right." Croft, "Yet at some point you decided that you were black." I think for me that really brought home how difficult it is to get people to accept the concept of multiple identities. So the question is, how, when there's still that level of ignorance, can we really move this in any direction?
I think the first thing that's quite important is not to necessarily respond to every provocation. I don't like to think of myself as a kind of educational tool in terms of, you know, that in some way I have a civilizing, you know, I don't want that to be my role, to have a civilizing presence. Not that I want to be uncivilized, but that I don't see that as my task. But I don't see it also, well, I suppose, and therefore I don't see it as my task to necessarily, in those contexts, to respond to everything that, or you know, everything that someone lays down. I think the easiest way, or the not necessarily the easiest way, but the most effective way, is to turn those conversations around and to try to get people to understand where they're coming from, using their own story, you know, so that and that's not always possible, but that it's often possible. That I've been educated about things like gay rights, which I had no kind of knowledge of, or really proclivity for, if you see what I mean. Like growing up in a kind of working class area of Stevenage, gay was what you called people if they didn't give you crisps. You know, it was a general kind of branding sort of insult, and it took being pulled up on things and not being and deciding not to be defensive, and at times knowing gay people and just looking at how they behaved and what they had to deal with. And I don't think there's anything intrinsically about my upbringing or being black in Britain or whatever that would make that necessarily that would make that a necessarily logical conclusion. But you just have to be open to the idea that, first of all, you don't know everything, and that secondly, it's okay to make mistakes. And this is a place where people often kind of flounder, where people are brought up about something that they've said in a fairly congenial way, and they retreat into this kind of passive-aggressive, I know that, or, you know, the favourite one that I have to is, I hope you're not calling me racist. I think, do you hope that more than you hope that you're not racist, or you just hope that I'm not calling you racist? Because if I was calling you racist, you would know about it, and I'm not calling you that because I don't think that's a very useful thing to do, and maybe I don't even think it's true, but that somewhere in there you have to believe that people get it, or people can get it, that most people can get it, even if it's not obvious. And at times you have to walk away. Sometimes you have to say, you know, this isn't working for me. A kind of interesting example of this, before I really got into a lot of these subjects, was when I lived in Sudan as a 17, 18-year-old, and people would ask me where I was from, and I would say Britain. And then there was this kind of cognitive dissonance among Sudanese about, like, English means white, you're not white. And I decided I would give people 3 chances. You know, they would say, no, you're African. And I say, well, sort of, but I'm actually from England. And then they'd say, African man from England. And I would say, yes, African man from England. See, African, 2. And then after the 3rd chance, I'd just be like, okay, you know, obviously we're not going to be friends.
I mean, you have to pick your battles.
Exactly, yeah, you do have to pick your battles.
But in terms of, you know, the interview that I just read with Steve Croft, I mean, you can't dismiss this kind of refusal to accept the concept of multiple identities as a fringe element. Would you say it's actually quite widespread? And it leads on something else which you talk about in the book, which is that people who have the luxury of not having to think about their identity are often the ones who say, they don't have an interest, they don't actually want to learn about multiple identities. And I just want to read this. He said, in practice, it's always been only particular identities that the American right has had a problem with. Appealing to white male and national identities has been a central part of conservative politics for more than a century. So when it's in the interest of a powerful group not to acknowledge identity, then they don't. So how can we address that?
Well, I think that, I mean, going back to your first point about choosing the battles, there is this thing, say, Obama's talking to Steve Croft. First of all, he's standing for election. And secondly, there's only so much education that you're going to get in a 10-minute interview or whatever. So it's also choosing your battles is partly about choosing your moments, I think. And that quite often, I think, we are not going to solve this, you know, the issue of 600 years of Irish nationalism. We're not going to solve this dinner time. So, and this conversation is running into the ground, and I'm going to stop there. When it comes to, because it is interesting that the primary force for promoting identity in the moment, because the left is embarrassed about identity mostly. They either there's a section of the hard left that think that we should only talk about class, whereas I think that class without identity doesn't make any sense, in the same way that identity without class doesn't make any sense. And then there's another part of the left that thinks that all of this leads inevitably to fundamentalism and you know, particularly this kind of liberal angst about multiculturalism at the moment and so on. But it's the right who promote, let's say in this country, Englishness, and who in another moment would promote masculinity. The BNP's monthly magazine is called Identity, and what they talk about is the oppression of they say there is a problem of racism in this country. It's the racism against white people. So I think one of the first things to, I think there are 2 things that really help this conversation. The first is to get rid of any sense of any inherently progressive ideology that comes with an identity. That gay people are necessarily liberal, or that black people are necessarily left-wing, or that, you know, that so black people can be homophobic if they're straight. Of course they can be. And that somehow that always catches people out. They always think, well, you know, how could you? You know, why would you? And we saw this with the, I think, with the Una King and Diane Abbott both standing, that the way that their identities were evoked was as though it was inevitably a wonderful thing that they were standing, without looking at what they were saying or where they were going. And if you do that, then the inevitable conclusion is that Margaret Thatcher was a great thing because she was a woman. And isn't it great to have women in power? Well, it depends what they're doing. And it was Angela Davis, who I interviewed, who talked about the diversity in the modern period being the difference that makes no difference and the change that brings no change. So long as things look different, it doesn't matter if they act the same. Another way that I describe that is photo opportunities rather than equal opportunities. So you just get a group of people looking, it's like a Benetton ad, and that makes people feel good, but it doesn't actually change anything. And that breeds a large amount of cynicism in the kind of people that I think can be won over. The second thing is to understand that there is nothing inherently reactionary in any identity either. That whiteness does not equal reactionariness, that masculinity does not equal violence, that there is nothing, that being American is a statement of fact about where you're born or where you have citizenship. It is not an ideology. And that then releases the possibility of there being cultures of resistance in areas where they are seldom found. And the reason that or a way in which that's important to me would be an argument that I make in the book is about integration and how if you're for example, a young Bengali person and you are asked to integrate into a country that won't employ you or that can't employ you, that won't or can't house you, that won't or can't educate you, how do you do that? What meaningfully does that mean? That you must integrate. You're stuck in some godforsaken housing estate somewhere. How do you do that? But that is equally a question that we could ask of the white working class too. If you're stuck in some terrible housing estate on the corner of South Shields, they're not integrated either. And so when certain groups see this language being used about non-white people and culture and anti-racism and defense, a lot of them, quite rightly, I think, or understandably, think, what about us? Why is nobody talking about us? And that comes about in no small part because of a lax way in which we talk about difference, I think.
But you also in the book talk about your experience in France, and just to summarise, for those who haven't read the book yet, it's an intensely racist experience, very prejudiced society in an open and overt way that maybe other places you have been weren't. I was in France last week when the World Cup football team, the French team, returned, and on primetime TV, French news, the question was being asked, is it because there are too many black players in the squad? That there's a ghetto mentality. It's the exact phrase used. So, but it seems that France is an example of a country that hasn't got that language of multiculturalism and diversity. So if France is at kind of one end of the spectrum and the UK is at the other, who's got it right?
Well, the way I like to describe, when people say, what is so-and-so worse or better, I always say, they're just different. When Americans say, which is a better place? I say, well, you can be president here, but you're much more likely to get shot. So, between the devil and the deep blue sea, there lies something of the truth. The problem for France, and I do deal with this in the chapter on the enemy within, I think, is that they are in official denial of the fact that there are many different races and cultures living in France. So emerging from the French Revolution comes this notion that everybody's a citizen and there's no way of dividing that into anything underneath that, a very egalitarian principle. The problem is that is not actually lived in France. And therefore, while the French can't count how many people, it's just not allowed to count how many people there are of different races, because that would be a violation of their Unitarian kind of sensibility. The fact is that if you are of a different race or a different religion, it counts. People if you look at the rates of unemployment and where people live and all the rest of it, housing, education, those things don't happen by accident. And so, and France has not found a way to deal with that, and therefore its official language is always feels like a throwback to a different age. And that the problem there for me in that is that 1789 there was a massive secular uprising against against the monarchy and the Catholic Church. The French are treating Islam, the minority, a religion of a mostly brown-skinned minority, as though in 2010, as though it's the Catholic Church in the 18th century, a powerful monoracial, virtually, or the powerful statist religion, and that doesn't work. You know that. One, attacking the Catholic Church in the 18th century is about talking truth to power. The other, dealing with Muslims in France, is mostly slurring the powerless. And so they have to develop a new language that is in keeping with their tradition, but that which acknowledges a new reality. I don't think anybody's got it right. And not just on race. I think this is an ongoing. This is going to be an ongoing struggle. It's not definitely not going to be solved in my lifetime. The one thing I would say about that chapter in France, because while I was there for 6 months, I was studying at the Sorbonne, and I would be routinely asked my colour when I called up and asked about flats, and I ended up in this peculiar situation, thanks to a kind of wonderfully handsome old Etonian, in a glorious apartment just next to the Pantheon in the 5th arrondissement. And it was wonderful. And it was actually the experience, because the woman was a journalist and she needed someone to teach her English in the mornings because she'd just got a new job and told her that she spoke English and she'd lied. And it was wonderful, apart from the fact that no black people lived there. And so literally every single day I would be stopped for my papers. And I was, a student, tracksuit bottoms, plaits down to my shoulder. My story was implausible. I'm a student at the Sorbonne and I'm living around the corner. And so I would be held up, most days. 10, 15 minutes, 2 men with guns. At one stage, I was beaten up in the metro by cops. Colour bars were routine. And I end that kind of vignette by talking about being on this student demonstration. I was just there for curiosity's sake. And this young Arab kid, young French Arab kid, putting his foot through a window of this fancy restaurant and seeing the look on this very bourgeois gentleman's face as this thin veneer between him and his meal and the street was kind of crushed, and being really happy. And that I'm not saying that these are equivalent things at all, but that essentially destructive capacity that alienation can bring out in someone, I think is on the way to the kind of where some of these bombers are coming from. Not the same thing. It's not the same thing at all. I wasn't driven by religion. It was. If you look at the biographies of these people, they are generally lost and alienated, and then they latch onto something, and then they're off, and then they kind of disappear from friends and family, and that level of anomie that was in me, and of disgust and distaste for the kind of people I was surrounded by, was kind of, scary. That I would take joy in looking at fear in a man's face that I didn't know. And yet, I hope, as I describe how I got there, being stopped every day, knowing that I was 24 hours away from being stopped by a cop, there was logic to it too.
That chapter on The Enemy Within about Muslims in Britain, where you draw that conclusion that it's a combination of their economic situation and their perception of foreign policy and what's happening in Iraq and Afghanistan, that's been criticised by some of the people who've reviewed the book. And Safraz Manzoor, who wrote in The Guardian, for example, said that doesn't stand up because the first generation of Asian immigrants who came experienced more overt racism and discrimination, were probably stopped more by the police, and they weren't radicalised. So how can you explain this generation's radicalisation that way? So what do you say to those criticisms?
That I also do say, what I do is I follow in that chapter, it's kind of hooked around this man, Farazat. And Farazat was this hardcore lefty. Wasn't a demonstration he couldn't get himself arrested on. Had lots of female friends, lots of gay friends. A few things happen in his family life. He nearly goes to jail. He finds religion, he disappears. And then he comes out as a fundamentalist. He won't let his daughter watch cartoons. He really wants his daughter to be educated, and then he wants to be married. He marries his cousin. He tells her that she must wear the veil in the presence of her cousins. He becomes a kind of domestic tyrant in a way. And there's a bit where he says he never felt English. Whatever else he felt, he never felt English. So I do talk about that issue of kind of belonging and how Britain is a far more difficult country to permeate in terms of feeling like you're part of it. That the story I tell is of a guy at university, an old buffer guy, saying to me, "Mr. Young, where are you from?" And I said, "Stevenage." And he said, "Well, where were you born?" And I said, "Hitchin." And he said, "Well, before then." I said, "Well, there was no before then." "Where are your parents from?" "Barbados." "Ah, so you're from Barbados." And that notion of what it takes to be English, the impermeability, unlike, for example, America, which for all of the different ways in which we might criticize America, I have cousins in America who feel very American. The question of like, who are you going to support in a World Cup or whatever, just wouldn't kind of come up. And so there are different ways of doing that, and we do that very badly. So in the absence of that, he doesn't feel British, but at the end I say, "So would you like to live in Pakistan?" And he says, "God, no, God." You know, he says, "No, all the corruption and the heat, God, you know, I couldn't bear it." And so, unlike, and there are two key ways in which I think that criticism of their parents face much more racism and so on falls down. The first is their parents had jobs. They were either they were in the Midlands and the North, and they had jobs in foundries, textiles, car plants, or they were down south and they were in family-owned businesses and textiles and so on. So first of all, their parents had jobs, and secondly, their sense of themselves was firmly rooted in somewhere else. And so, in the same way that my mother would often shrug off some of the British racism as being, well, you know, at the end of the day, these aren't necessarily my people, their children are born into a no man's land where they don't really feel Pakistani, and they don't really, or aren't allowed to feel as British as they would like. And there's a chasm there that's going to be filled by something. And those, I think, are two quite important differences. I think that, and this is complicated by the fact that most of the people who do the bombing, or many of the people that do the bombing, are actually pretty well off and well educated, and that is often the nature with radical and or reactionary kind of terrorist organizations, actually. But that the foot soldiers for many of these fundamentalist movements are lost. And that's why I I shudder when I see elements of people who consider themselves the liberal left or the right saying you must choose between Islam and this, Islam and Saudi, that the price for belonging to Britishness, that you have to be. This was in the FT the other day. There was a leader, and it said immigrants must sign up to Western values like gender equality. That's more of a Western value, I would say. Although if you look at how women are paid and how women are treated, we've still got a long way to go before we get there. And gay rights. And I thought, since when has gay rights been a Western value? It's not even a Californian value. They couldn't even pass gay marriage in California. And so suddenly, these people it's being demanded of them, not just that they be British, but that they be anti-sexist, anti-homophobic, pro-secular, pro-democratic, all of these things. And I think, well, I just don't think that is actually, and they're born here. So it's not like they're being asked in some ceremony to sign up for these things. And nobody else is being asked to do that. Whatever else people say about the EDL or the BNP, nobody says they're not British. Whatever, I mean, some of us would like them to be somewhere else, on a different planet, but nobody suggests that they're not British. Nobody says of football hooligans, well, they're not British. There's an understanding that it's a British problem, but the idea that you must do this, this, and this, or you won't be British. Therefore, given those choices, and given what Britain's done in Iraq and Afghanistan and its policies in the Middle East, the idea that a young, intelligent Muslim will look at those two choices and say, I'll go with British. I'll go with this country that can't employ me and can't educate me and can't house me, and so I'll do that. I won't go with this community that I know and that will protect me and that's being attacked. It's just unfeasible. And that, in a way, what I want to do, if there's an aim for this book, is to cast out that huge space where most people live, which is live and let live. And where people deal with stuff they don't like and embrace things that maybe they don't understand but think they might like. And that's not just where most people live, but where most people want to live. And that the extremists, whether they're Muslim fundamentalists or nationalists, British nationalist fundamentalists, or whoever, are the people who are constantly trying to force this choice on us. Either you're with Jack Straw or you're with the niqab. And it's like, well, can't I not like the niqab and understand that people have a right to wear what they want? Why can I not do that? But when they pose things in that sense, then everything becomes polarized and people make bad decisions.
I think you describe that as, identity is not a zero-sum game, I think is the phrase used in the book, and you apply that to women and the failure to understand that a woman can also be a black woman at the same time, and to immigrants. I've got so many more questions I could ask, but I'm going to open it up. So if I imagine there are some questions, and I want to make sure there are time for them. So who has a question for Gary? Yeah.
Hi, Gary.
Hi.
If you could just introduce yourself as well, that would be great.
Maxine Williams.
And I know that Maxine has flown all the way from the
Geneva.
States.
No, Geneva.
Geneva. Oh,
Geneva.
The States via Geneva.
Yes. I work for a global firm, and I'm the diversity director. And I find that when I'm working in the London office, I've just come from a meeting, even though you describe the difference between France and London, or in England, and say that there people are not allowed to discuss difference, or it's the law that you can't collect data. Something I'm confronted with all the time here is that everyone seems to, I don't know if it's that they're pretending that there aren't these differences and that there aren't inequalities, or that no one wants to admit it. But even the people who appear to me, and in fact, by demographic evidence, are minorities, will often say, I'm not a minority. I don't consider myself a minority. And therefore, I don't want your help, thank you. How does one deal with that? If you want to make progress, the discussion ends there, right? If even that group says, I don't know what you're talking about. I'm not a minority. But when you look at the top in any corporate system, they're not there. But they don't connect that at all to their status as what I see as a minority. How do you have this discussion without making it think like, I think, am I creating a problem? Am I giving people problems that they don't think they have?
Well, I think that, I mean, there are a couple of things there. And one is, good people get nervous. Good people get nervous. I was described, this wasn't my first week at The Guardian that Dominique facilitated, but it would have been in the first year. Someone said, who's Gary Younge? And there were about 3 black people in the whole building. And he said, it's the short, stocky guy with an earring. Because he was nervous and he thought I'm assuming and didn't want to say. So if it said the black guy, it was, that would have been really easy. And that one thing that's important in that sphere, I think, is to contribute to the kind of environment where people feel relaxed enough to make mistakes and to speak their mind in the hope that their mind isn't full of filth, or that if it is, that it's stuff that can be dealt with. That it's not, the suppression of these things doesn't really help. But that people often think that by denying difference, they are in some way have reached some kind of utopian, which when people say, for example, I'm colorblind, I was saying, well, blindness is a disability, and there are things that you can do for colorblindness, but it actually doesn't change certain facts. The grass is still green, the sky is still blue. It just means that you can't see it. So if you're colorblind, all you're not seeing is a group of people who aren't getting stuff and another group of people who are. So there's that. And I think our primary thing is creating the climate where people feel more comfortable and less anxious. But there's another thing as well, I think, which is tricky, and this was my point about Tiger Woods, that everybody has the right to call themselves whatever they want. And that's not just important because it's an indulgence, it's also important because if they don't, then someone else will own their nomenclature, if you like. They will own their naming, and that and so you can't actually you can tell someone they're a minority, but if they don't think they are, then that's difficult. And for example, in France, where routinely, I haven't been to France for a little while now, but it was the case that routinely non-white people were called immigrants. That immigrants and non-white were synonymous, and that I was on a radio show with a French woman in the States, and she was talking about immigrants, and I said, I just want to be clear about who you're talking about here. Are you talking about people who aren't white, or are you talking about people who have come from somewhere else? And she said, you know what I mean. And I said, I fear I do. I fear I do. But I want you to explain what you mean, because I think it could be very elucidating for the audience. But the right to self-definition must at least come with one qualification, which is that whatever you call yourself must make sense. And in the absence of it making sense, this is the point about Cablinasian. Well, then go Cablinasian, and we haven't created a world yet where that makes sense. And the identities I'm talking about are social and political and sometimes economic identities. They're not how I'm feeling today. It's not sad and happy and so on. And that in the absence of what you call yourself making sense, you are going to have to find the gap between your self-image and your reality. Now, how you tell someone, how you convince someone that they are something that they're not, I'm not sure that you can. I think that all one can do as sympathetically as one possibly can, because you're trying to create an environment where that can happen, is point out the contradictions in what they're saying. And an example in the book is I talked to this woman who works for this multiracial campaigning organization. And she said, well, Obama's mum was white and his dad was black. And so he could call himself just another white president. And I said, well, he could call himself that, but like no one would understand him as that. And she said, but on paper, he is. And I said, okay, but who's going to read that paper and make any sense of it? Because if it's just things that you can call yourself, then I call myself Denzel Washington. There you go. And I want my check, and you know, and I want my next movie. If that's the beginning and the end of your understanding of identity, then it falls apart at the first hurdle, which is that it doesn't make sense to anybody else.
But Gary, how can you impose that objective standard that it must make sense without then becoming a gatekeeper? And then you talk about, you know, there are the gatekeepers who police those identities and say whether they make sense or not.
Well, I suppose I'd like to think it's not me who is going to determine whether it makes sense or not. I just say, okay, let Obama go out and try that. Hi, I'm a white guy, you know, and see how that works out for him. And so it's really not down, you know, it's actually kind of not down to me. If in the next 10 or 15 years it became true that black people in Britain started calling themselves Afro-Saxons, well, that wouldn't be my preferred naming. But after a while, if these things have currency, then you have to deal with them. And it's not going to, and that currency isn't actually determined by me. It's determined by any individual. It's shaped by a consensus. And so if we look at how different things have changed, let's say the term Ms, which was, even when I was growing up, you know, it would be Miss or Mrs, you know, that's what I would ask. And if someone said Ms, then the wag at the other end would be like, oh, Ms, and it would be this kind of pejorative. And then over a while, it's got to the point where, for reasons that I'd rather not go into, I was playing Super Mario Wii at the weekend, and one of the characters was Ms. something or other. And it's kind of got, you know, it's got that far. We've gone from Negro to coloured to black to African American. And those things have happened by a series of struggles and a process of establishing new consensuses. And so there is a problem. I mean, there could be a gatekeeper problem there, but the point I'm making about Obama isn't, or about this woman, isn't that I don't think it makes sense. It's that, you know, I say to her, who would read that? Who would read that paper and make sense out of it?
Okay, another question. I said I'd go to you. Gentleman in the white T-shirt.
Thanks very much for that, Gary. My name's John Booth, and it's a wonderful transformation from The Guardian that I came back to 30 years ago from the Washington Post to hear you described as the short, stocky guy with the earring. On the Washington Post, when I left 30 years ago, 3 of my superiors were women and 2 of them were black. And in the Guardian newsroom, there wasn't a single black face. And the only 2 women, one was the woman's editor, and the other was Frances Cairncross, who was the economics editor. And it's a mark of some kind of change. I think there's still a long way to go. The more serious thing I'd ask you about in relation to the demonization of Muslims is how much that's been a deliberate policy. Because my sense is very much that it has. Bernard Lewis, Huntington, Clash of Civilizations, Netanyahu and the Jonathan Institute moving on from the Cold War and the demonization of state-sponsored terrorism backed by the Kremlin to Islamic fundamentalism. I think there's a deliberate, proactive political agenda here, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, I mean, I do. I suppose there are a few things. I think definitely terrorism doesn't help, and it's not. It's important to include that in an understanding of what's going on right now, because unlike previous racial dynamics in Britain, there may have been a fear of Afro-Caribbeans rioting or of disorder, but there wasn't a general fear of that people might have of being blown up racially. There was in terms of Ireland, but interestingly, that was not racialized as such. I mean, there is a racial narrative to the way that Britain understands Ireland, but nobody, or very few people in mainland Britain, there were some, drew a direct link between the bombings and Catholicism. And it's one of those kind of crazy things when, particularly in this country, when the discussion turned to the shock that we would have homegrown bombers, you know, that these young Muslim kids, that they were grown at home. I think, well, Britain's been growing its own bombers for years, or the United Kingdom has anyway, and we actually have a day or an evening that's devoted to one Guy Fawkes night, you know, and so this is not actually something new, and this comes to your point really, that if we look at that history, it came from an anti-colonialist struggle that was had a militarized wing. And that similarly, in this moment, we have, and this to some extent started before 9/11, but 9/11 is what gave it, I think, its consensual and broad-based nature. And then 7/7 continued that. That we have this moment at which we have our Middle Eastern policy and a primarily fairly uncritical approach to Israel. We have the war in Iraq, the war in Afghanistan, torture, the 8 years in which Britain wed itself to Bush, and shots of Abu Ghraib. And one thing that we, when I say we, I mean me and my 41-year-old self, and I think other people who are maybe 35 or older, is that a lot of these kids who are drawn to fundamentalist Islam would have been 10 during 9/11. This is what they've known. This is their entire upbringing. Has been these sporadic acts of terrorism and more concerted acts of either state terror or torture or violation of human rights regulations and so on. And that the conversation about Muslims is peculiarly divorced from that. And so on the one hand, it's like, why do these people not want to be British? Why do they hate us? Why are they? And on the other hand, you've got this kind of rolling on a loop, these visions of war and plunder, and this failure to understand that there might be a connection between those, which every single examination, interrogation, or survey suggests that there is a connection between those two things, as well as poverty. So I think that, and finally, then there has been a kind of cultural wing to this. The Huntingtons that you mentioned, a fairly expressive, somewhat liberal wing actually, who call themselves liberal, who argued for the bombing of Afghanistan in defense of women's rights, as though they weren't going to bomb women, who argue, well, the English Defence League, which is primarily Islamophobic, that's the primary means through which it kind of peddles its wares, they have a lesbian and gay chapter, and they wear pink triangles, as in the Holocaust, and their thing is, defense of gay rights against Muslims, as though fascists have some wonderful record on gay rights. And so there is this place where the military types, a certain kind of liberal type, and very right-wing people can meet. And that's what gives it its toxic force, I think, is the kind of the voices of, I don't want to say rationalism, because it's not rationalism, but I would argue voices of kind of reason even, or that kind of people who are asking questions, even factual questions. The whole thing about Britain sleepwalking into segregation, and that segregation is somehow to do with this, and that if you look at where every single bomber has come from, they've had a very integrated life. Very integrated life. And it's actually been, as much as one can make any general conclusions about this, their disillusionment with their kind of higher end of teenage years experience as young, they're nearly all men, as young men in Britain, that has begun their path to engage in terrorism. But that to raise any of these questions, there was a period after 9/11 and then after July 7th, where to even make basic, what I thought were basic statements, were considered kind of off limits. So, I mean, I did one after 7/7 where I said, did we think that we could declare war on terror and that terror would not fight back? This is not an argument against the Iraq war, the argument I'm making there. It's just, we have signed up for this. The idea that somehow all of the violence and mayhem could take place somewhere else is ludicrous. But that we are in a place, and it ebbs and flows, where asking those kind of questions puts you in a small and quite vilified minority who you're accused of not caring about terrorism, not caring about gay people, not caring about women, and an evocation of some utopian notion of multiculturalism that you're supposed to be wedded to, that is hindering any kind of actual progress. So I think that you have a military wing, you have a political wing, and you have a cultural wing. That is a kind of very serious trifecta for us to deal with, and that's what we're up against.
Got time for one more question. Okay, I saw you first, gentleman at the back. Yeah.
Thanks very much for the book you've written. I'm really looking forward to it. You mentioned about Obama, and in the States it just seems it's so much easier in terms of the interview you mentioned, whereby I'm black, I'm white, I'm black, I'm white. In America, it's much easier to just be black or white, and in America, whereby no matter what complexion, no matter what shade or complexion you are, you're considered black. Here we have in the UK the sort of emerging definition of mixed race. And I'd like to know your opinion of that, as you mentioned, identity and power. And who's responsible for that, as now people seem to be shifting away from this notion of blackness into this sort of mixed race category?
I mean, first of all, I know this isn't quite what you meant, but that I think in all sorts of ways it's quite tough to be black in America. I know what you mean is a kind of comfort zone, yes, and I suppose I would say a few things. Some are differences that would make that possible. One is that there are far more black Americans. make 12% of the population African Americans, or actually black Americans. They've been there for longer, and therefore they've had time to build a comfort zone. I mean, non-white people have been in Britain for centuries, but only in numbers, large numbers, since after the Second World War. And you know, I think it takes a while. Secondly, because America had codified segregation, that meant, much like apartheid, that these delineations had to be sharp, even when they can't be sharp. They had to be sharpened, if you like. So my father-in-law is, he could pass. He's a very, very light-skinned African-American man from Louisiana. And when you ask him, so why didn't you pass? He says, well, I was, first of all, only 2 or 3 questions away from being found out. Where do you live? What school do you go to? What church do you go to? But secondly, that was where my community was. That to pass, what you have to do is just say goodbye to everybody. I mean, literally everybody. They can't come visit. Christmas cards, maybe, so long as there's no pictures, you know. But and so it's it was a strong community, in part, paradoxically, because it was a segregated community. That meant that it had to be, the community had to be black and might be strong. And finally, black America has a sizable underclass, but also a sizable middle class. So there's money there. And that money also can bring comfort. It can bring enough, if you add the numbers to the wealth, you have enough people and resources to have a self-sustaining cultural industry, to have a TV channel or several, to have magazines, to have local black papers, to have large, you know, black hair. I mean, black women in America spend as much on hair care as Gambia's GDP. So you're talking about a lot of money there. And in that money, there is a lot of, you know, that buys cultural space. It can buy cultural space. Britain's history is different. We've been here less long in numbers. We haven't had codified segregation here. So your community is much more likely to be shaped around geography than necessarily race. So we have a much higher rate of mixed race relationships than they do in America, because we don't have that legacy of codified segregation here. And we have less money. We're still primarily a working class community, and less money means less comfort in that way. And the way I look upon it in Britain is actually as a work in progress. I mean, I think it wouldn't be the first country to develop some kind of Métis or Creole culture. If it did, I think that's probably unlikely, but it doesn't scare me. I don't think that necessarily people who define themselves as mixed race are necessarily turning their back on their blackness. I think what they might be doing is trying to find a description for their that makes sense of their entire kind of upbringing. Not least because in many, many cases, these mixed race people have been raised by their white mothers and their black fathers are off. And so they're trying to find a way to describe themselves that makes sense. And some people see it as divisive. I don't think it necessarily is. It's not that I have a problem with, but I like to interrogate, starting with race, because we're all mixed race, like I said at the beginning. And so not everybody counts as mixed race, but it's very difficult to find people who haven't been involved in some ethnic mixing. It's just that often it's well hidden, or they're not counted as different ethnic groups. But at some stage, the Anglos and the Saxons got together and they made Anglo-Saxons. That's a mixed race relationship as far as I'm concerned. They weren't from the same place. I mean, it's if we expand our understanding of what we mean by race, then suddenly you see that mixing has been part of humankind for a long time. It's not going to stop. How that plays out is really about power. Is really, you know, that those Creole communities that did emerge, mostly in the Caribbean, emerged because there was a power in being Creole that didn't exist in being black. I'm not sure that in Britain that power exists, and so I think it might be a purely somewhat descriptive way of talking about who you are and where you're from. But I think it's a work in progress, and I don't really know what people are necessarily saying when they claim that, and I'm always interested to find out. There's also the thing about multiple identities that many people who describe themselves as mixed race also describe themselves as black. Those two things they don't see as mutually exclusive. They are just kind of keen to give a full description of their upbringing.
Have we got time for one more? Yeah, one more question. Actually, I'd like to. Yes, lady there.
Hi, my name is Chisom Eke. Okay, I would just like to pick up on an observation that I made that just after you'd finished your reading, Afua kind of reached the conclusion that, so what you're saying is that identity is divisive. And so my question is in relation to the process of cultural imperialism, which is kind of driven by corporate-led globalization, and the way that actually this is kind of distorting identities in developing countries. And it's kind of corporate-led globalization that is neoliberal, essentially, in character, with the objective of actually, you know, getting people in developing countries to buy into Western culture as a means towards driving Western markets and generating kind of more profit for the West. So I would like to kind of know your opinion about that process. And then the other side of corporate-led globalization, which is much more violent, which is actually leading to the complete disappearance and genocide of entire communities around the world. And here I'm talking about indigenous communities all over the world that are living on resource-rich lands that they consider to be their ancestral lands, but which they are being forced off just because of kind of profit-seeking multinational corporations that are wanting to exploit the resources where they are based. So in that way, actually, you know, there are whole identities that are disappearing, and, you know, there are projections that in the next 100 years that perhaps 10,000 languages are going to disappear. So from that point of view, you know, I would like to know what you think about that process of corporate-led globalization and the fact that actually, you know, it's making the world poorer from the perspective of diversity and identity.
First off, if I gave the impression, or Afua gave the impression, about identity being divisive, I think
what I said, that division can be dangerous, but not that identity is necessarily divisive.
Yeah, that it can be divisive. That's the whole point about the wolf. It can be, but it's not. It's not inevitably or necessarily. Here's what I think about kind of neoliberal globalization in general. I think it will answer some of your points, but not all of them. First of all, the globalization process, I'm not saying that you were saying this, but this is just my kind of broad view on it. The globalization process isn't new. Slavery was a form of globalization, actually, and the conquering of the Americas was a form of globalization. You know, that all of these things, when people travel and create new markets, that is about globalization. And the neoliberal bit is the latest bit, but we've already lost loads of languages, and we're almost certainly going to lose more, and that is a terrible thing. And it is part of a kind of multi-pronged approach from global capital, which has several terrible consequences and a few possibilities. The possibility is that because these companies know no borders and actually are often far more powerful than any individual state, so BP has shown itself to be actually far more powerful than the American state. It has done this thing and they can't stop it. They never regulated it. They never tried to rein it in, and now this monster has been created. What's sad is that in previous years, the people of Louisiana didn't seek common cause with the Ogoni people, because actually this has happened before, but it happened before in a place they didn't care about. And actually, if you got some people from the Ogoni land and some people from Louisiana in a room right now, they'd have a lot to talk about. And that increasingly, it creates the possibility, and only the possibility, also for global resistance to make these connections. Because nation states, and therefore democracies, are severely diminished by these multinational companies who are far more powerful than any state. If you look at the election in Britain in May, they would go straight from the counts to the markets, because whoever you vote for, the market was going to decide, you know, what it thought, and that was what we were going to have to deal with. This latest round of cuts were about the markets. They were, you know, anything less than something that satisfied the markets would not satisfy the polity. But we don't get to vote for the people in the markets. And so we have this dislocation between politics and power, that we talk about who will win, but not what will change, because what will change is not within the democratic remit anymore of any single nation state. And there's no global entity that can control it, which is why I think there is this kind of rise of powerlessness, this sense of powerlessness. But it also has this major effect that you're describing on the developing world, which is not just about, it's about destroying economies, actually. And one very good example, resonant because it's what slavery was built on, is cotton. That Mali and I think it's Chad and Burkina Faso, I think it is, that depend on cotton. But the US cotton industry is very powerful in the South and subsidizes the US cotton industry with more. They spend more on lobbying than Mali has. And so they're able to price Mali out of the market by selling this cheap stuff, even as they talk about free trade. And I remember interviewing Jesse Jackson and him saying, when people ask why do black people do better at sport than they do at other things, I always tell them, well, in sport, the rules are known and the field is even. But elsewhere, people keep tipping up the field and changing the rules as they go along. And that's why we have so much problems. And globally, that is very clear. Now, one of the consequences of that is that if you trash a country's economy, people have to eat, and people will go where food is. And very good examples in the Caribbean, where you have these quite small countries, St. Lucia, Dominica, places like that, who are completely undermined by US banana industry that's coming out of US companies, but in Costa Rica. That's like closing down a pit village. It's like closing down a pit in a village. That's their industry, it's been closed. Well then, what do you expect is going to happen? First of all, people will find industries where they can. That may be the drug industry. These are islands in between South America, North America and Europe. Tourism is not a great industry to depend on, and people will migrate. People will move to where food is and where work is. Norman Tebbit said, oh, you know, my dad got on his bike and went for work. Well, now people are kind of holding onto the bottoms of trains and climbing into plane halls in order to find work. And the West's response to this is to fortify and criminalize. And that means building 20-foot fences. But a hungry person will build a 21-foot ladder to get over that fence. They have to. And this is one of those areas where I think you can actually make a connection with people when they say, oh, we're not having an honest debate about immigration. I think, well, let's have an honest debate about immigration. If we talk about where refugees and asylum seekers come from, more than half of all refugees and asylum seekers under UNHCR remit come from Iraq and Afghanistan. We did that. So if you want to stop, I honestly think people should be able to travel wherever they like. I think, you know, during the Eastern Bloc, during the Cold War, it was supposed to be terrible that they didn't let, you know, one of the problems was that they didn't let people out. Then as soon as the wall came down, we built up another wall and said they couldn't come in. I actually believe that people should be able to travel where they want. But it's also true that large numbers of people actually don't want to travel. They just want to eat. And because of our trade policies, our foreign policy, and climate change, they can't. And so an honest discussion about immigration would say, if we change our foreign policy, our trade policy, and our environmental policy, that will actually deal with a large amount of what you're worried about. We also have to deal with some of the racism that's coming out, but actually, large number of these people who are coming here actually want to stay at home. So if you want to stay at home, you need to change you need to reform the government that you have. The problem then comes that whichever government you vote for, the markets get in. So even if people wanted to do that, it's difficult to know how they would. One description that I have in the book is of a fictional Hungarian family who bought their house with euros because the interest rate for the florin was way too high. This is what happened in Hungary. They bought their house with euros. Then the florin collapses during a credit crunch, and suddenly their mortgage payments go through the roof that they can barely afford. It goes up like 2.5 times. They're broke. There's an election in Hungary. But whoever they vote for is not going to be able to cure that problem. So even if they went on a demonstration, where would they demonstrate? Who would they demonstrate against? What would they do? And it's in that moment of powerlessness that people then will turn to some fascist organisation who's going to blame it on the gypsies. And so in all sorts of ways, this, or foreigners, or whoever it is. And so it gets us coming and it gets us going. This issue of globalization, because it actually also crushes domestic democratic aspirations in the West, even as it's crushing living standards primarily in the global South. Where I'd end, in a hopeful note, is that I honestly think that if, in a less colourful way, and probably without a call for open borders, I think most British people would get that if it were ever explained to them. If immigration was understood as a global problem that emerges from these things, I think large numbers, maybe not most, but enough. But the problem with our politics is that it's, to my knowledge, on a large platform, it's rarely been tried. Instead, they pander and they resort to the kind of very, very most basic kind of atavistic kind of prejudices of people. But lots of British people understand being broke. They don't really understand being hungry, I don't think. That's a good thing about this country. But they understand being broke, and they understand what they would do not to be broke. And I think that they'd get it. I think they'd get it, but they don't get it if they're not asked. And that would be an appeal to their humanity. That would be an appeal to their common humanity. And that's something that is all too rarely done that goes over the heads of all of the identities, the race, the nation, the religion, and says, you don't get much identity for less than $2 a day. And what would you do if you lived for $2 a day? Where would you go to get food? How would you feed your family? It's got to be worth a try, because the stuff they've tried so far isn't working.
I think we'll leave it on that note. Thank you very much, Gary.